So go ahead and put your questions right into the chat box and we'll get to them as we go through everything. But with that, I'm going to toss it over to our Executive Director, Joe Barella. Joe?
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. I am just going to give you some comments and update you on the fraud activity and the fraud work that we continue to do here at the department. So, as all of you know, unemployment fraud is an issue states have been dealing with across the country since the pandemic began, and there is still a high amount of fraudulent activity happening nearly a year later. Addressing improper payments and fraud is a top priority for the department and the entire UI system nationwide, especially during this time of continued extraordinary workloads. CDLE has maintained a steadfast focus on UI functions and activities that ensure program integrity and the prevention and detection of improper payments and fraud, while also ensuring that legitimate claimants are able to access benefits during this difficult time of financial hardship. We have consistently implemented processes that ensure payments are being made to eligible individuals and have aggressive strategies and tools in place to prevent, detect, and recover fraudulent payments, with a particular emphasis on imposter fraud for claimants using false or stolen identities. This work is not static and involves overtime. Unfortunately, there is no perfect solution. Again, we have a responsibility to pay legitimate claimants as quickly as possible, but also a fiduciary responsibility to protect the integrity of Colorado's unemployment fund. I have said over and over again for several months that we must walk a tightrope. We know we have to get payments out to legitimate claimants as quickly as possible, but with unprecedented fraudulent activity, we have to put in measures that prevent fraudulent players from accessing the system and payments going out the door. We do have and always have taken this responsibility very seriously. I also want to remind you that we have said over and over again that in 2019, we had less than 90 fraudulent claims to investigate in the entire year. Now we're dealing with more than 1 million suspicious claims. That's 1 million suspicious claims. We have been on the forefront of detecting, identifying, and preventing fraudulent activity since we began to see spikes of suspicious activity early last summer. From a UI benefit system that had 0 fraud indicators to one that now has 58 fraud indicators in place every night. With the launch of the Colorado Unemployment Insurance Fraud Task Force, we will soon be on the forefront of prosecuting the people behind the fraud. As we move into the prosecution phase of some of these cases, I will tell you now that we will not be answering any questions or release any data that may jeopardize the outcome of any of these investigations. Publicizing certain figures and or suspect fraud schemes may prevent us from recovering those stolen funds from criminals. When we reported our previous confirmed and suspected fraudulent payments amounts earlier this year, we knew that the number would keep going up. We have no intelligence or technology that would prevent people from taking stolen personal identifiable information and putting that into our system. We rely on, after that information is in our system, that we implement indicators and triggers that prevent fraud from being paid out the door. We hate to see that any money is lost to criminals, and we do everything to prevent that. I'd like to emphasize that all of our work to detect and prevent fraud has resulted in us preventing an estimated $37 billion in fraudulent payments from going out the door. And with that, I'll turn it over to Phil, who can share the numbers that we can share publicly without harming our efforts to recoup any of money lost. Phil?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for joining us today. And we're sure you'll have plenty of questions as we move along through this process and provide some information today. But I want you all to know that since the start of the pandemic, we have prevented $437.16 million in confirmed fraudulent payments. So I want to reiterate again, that's a confirmed fraudulent payment amount that I am giving you that we have prevented. This number is the amount we know we prevented after completing investigations. The confirmed number of fraudulent claims since the start of the pandemic is 42,976. Again, confirmed after investigations. We may have suspected fraud, but we need to confirm all of that fraud as we are moving through this process. So as investigations are ongoing, we continue to implement new fraud triggers. We do this every week. We meet with our vendor multiple times a week to do fraud analytics and new tools. And we are also bringing in new tools continually to stop these criminals. We estimate that we've actually prevented 37 billion in fraudulent payments and are dealing with about 1.1 million fraudulent claims. Again, those are estimates at this point in time. And as we continue to investigate, some of those numbers will move either north or south based on those investigations. As we've discussed in the past, the numbers very fluid and constantly changing, especially as we implement new prevention measures and clear holds. Some of these claims will move into confirmed, while some of them will be released as legitimate. This is why we give you those estimated figures. There seems to be an awful strong focus. Everyone wants to know the estimated figures, but again, those are extremely fluid every day. Those are not reliable numbers. What is more reliable is what we had confirmed through investigations at this point in time. So we do expect those figures to continue to change throughout the pandemic and throughout the following year. The amount of confirmed fraudulent payments lost, and this is what you've all been waiting for this week, and we've been trying to prep you for it. The amount that is lost, that is confirmed as lost, is 19.37 million. Again, that is compared to the 437.16 million that we have prevented. So again, I'll stop there just really quickly for you. The confirmed amount has gone up from that prior 6.5 million to 19.37 million, again, based on those investigations. Please understand that we are constantly updating our fraud triggers and implementing new strategies every day to stop criminals from collecting money not meant for them. ID.me is just one of those tools helping us to prevent this fraud. We certainly understand the frustration that innocent and legitimate claims are being held up or getting caught up with these holds in place or struggling with ID.me. And we look at these fraud holds every single week to determine whether or not to release a hold. So I'm going to go back just quickly and discuss, as we said earlier on, we meet with a vendor 3 times a week, where we perform network analysis on many of these holds and determine whether these individuals may be tied to other criminal organizations. When we go through that process, if we can release them because they are not tied to them, we release those holds to allow payment. But it is required that we perform this investigation at this point in time, just based on the sheer volume of fraud attempts that we had seen coming in. So again, based on our analysis of the level of increased fraudulent activity, we ultimately needed to put more aggressive preventative measures in place. At one point, we were seeing weeks of activity where fraud holds were being placed on 90% of claims, and that has since decreased since we have also implemented ID.me at this point in time. As we pointed out in the press release yesterday with the weekly claims data, we're already starting to see a decline in continued claims for the week ending April 3rd compared to the weeks and months prior because of the implementation of ID.me requirement, which you will see as Ryan later on discuss some of his numbers too. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Cher at this point in time to discuss a little more related to claimant communications and a little more on ID.me.
Thanks, Phil. And we will circle back to questions after I just provide a quick overview on ID.me. So as Phil said, seeing upwards of 90% of initial claims suspected as fraud, the federal government recognized that nationally this was an issue, and late last year required that all states implement a identification verification protocol, preferably one that uses biometrics technology. And so ID.me is that solution for the majority of states, where an individual has to complete a number of steps, uploading official identification documentation. If those steps are not successful for whatever reason, including a blurry photo, dimly lit photo, expired information, then that individual does need to engage with ID.me with a trusted referee. There's been a lot of activity we know into you all from claimants who have successfully completed the ID.me process and yet need to still speak with a trusted referee. Know that 85% of individuals do not need to engage with an agent. So the majority of people are able to follow that automated process successfully. For those that aren't, certainly we've heard there are some extended wait times for ID.me. ID.me, the vendor, the executives have told us that in the coming weeks, they are hoping to reduce those wait times significantly. And we look forward to reporting to you through the vendor's actions what those reduced wait times look like. So just for some perspective, since we implemented ID.me, over 1 million individuals have been directed to complete the process. We've been rolling this out in phases intentionally. It's important to note that earlier this week, it was reported by an outlet that we paused the ID.me verification process. That is not accurate. There was no pause in the verification process. It had always intended to be a phased-in approach. And soon, we hope by May, we will get through all of those who had been caught up in some sort of program integrity hold in the system. We started with the new pandemic unemployment assistance claims. We moved on to continued claims and working through the backlog of that million or so that Phil and Joe mentioned were suspected fraud. The goal is anybody who has a program integrity hold, either reported in, self-reported, or was flagged in our system as potential fraud, will have the opportunity to subsequently go through the ID.me verification process and confirm their identity. With that, it's also important to note that unemployment insurance is not an entitlement program, it's an eligibility program. And so you may hear from claimants who indicate that they did successfully complete the ID.me process and yet still have some sort of a hold on their claim. That may or may not be related to identity verification. It could be not eligible for benefits due to lack of work search, not monetary eligible, meaning they didn't earn enough wages in the period in question. So there are a number of issues that even though there is a successful ID.me verification, there still could be a hold on that claim. And the call to action for those folks is to call into the unemployment insurance call center. Many times also, we are working, as Phil said, in partnership with our vendor to review some of these program integrity holds. And there will be groups that are deployed every night for release or review due to a number of factors. So it's also important for claimants to return back to their MyUI Plus account regularly, because those holds are sometimes also released in mass once we do a review with the vendor and conduct those analytics. So with that, Jess, I think we'll stop and circle back to some questions.
Okay, we have got one in from Andy Kenny. Phil's going to go ahead and take Andy Kenny, and Blair's question is similar to Andy as well. So Phil will probably take both of those.
I'll take both. So Andy asks, knowing that the 19 million is confirmed only, can I give a sense of how much bigger the real number might be? 5 times, 10 times, 100 times? I think this goes into that discussion about not providing suspected figures at this point in time, Andy. Part of that is, remember, those numbers are always in flux at this point in time. So again, it's dependent upon investigations and as we actually confirm fraud. So it makes more sense to report confirmed fraud. Certainly suspected fraud provides for more salacious headlines on stories, or whether you're going to run a show at 10 o'clock tonight to have a salacious headline, but it's not the actual that has occurred. So at this point, what we're doing is we're sticking with the confirmed numbers, not discussing suspected numbers for multiple reasons. As Director Barella has mentioned, and as Cher has mentioned, as we've mentioned multiple times here, we are actually interested and also on confirmed fraud being able to recover as much of that as possible, so that any expenses to the federal taxpayers, because the bulk of fraud has occurred within the pandemic unemployment assistance program, that certainly alleviates problems for federal taxpayers as we look to recover as much of that as possible. So the more we discuss items related to that, whether it's suspected banks, suspected accounts, suspected rings, suspected amount of potential fraud, that can all impact those investigations and prevent us actually receiving those funds back by tipping off some of those gangs that perhaps are being investigated at this point in time. So I'm going to stay away from any suspected numbers for now and in the future. So I'm also going to move on to Blair's question. Blair said, similar to Andy's question, with the gap in estimated fraud payments going out at 37 billion and confirmed at 433 million. So Blair, I need to make sure that we're clear on what was said earlier. That estimated 37 billion is estimated in attempts that we have prevented. In other words, thieves have tried to abscond with $37 billion, but due to our fraud holds, we believe through those estimates that we have prevented that attempt at this point in time. And so then the one figure we have is the 433 odd million that you've discussed that is confirmed fraud. Again, that confirmed requires that full analysis on a claim. Again, whether it's through ID Me and then additional investigation, I will let all of you know, because each of you hear from individuals every day who indicate that they have passed ID Me and that they're still not receiving payment. As Cher noted, sometimes that's the result of other issues on an unemployment insurance claim. This is an eligibility program, and so individuals must be available, actively seeking work in order to receive payments also on the programs. There is another category of those where individuals will have or pass ID Me, but there is an egregious fraud hold on their unemployment insurance claim. I'm not going to discuss what those egregious fraud holds either are, because we are not going to provide any of our methods and means for preventing this kind of theft out there widely. Otherwise, we would be helping the criminal enterprises who are involved. So those ones do require additional investigation. You will find individuals who have successfully passed ID Me, and that is because they can verify who they are. However, they are engaged in fraudulent activity. We have individuals out there who are acting as mules. We have individuals who have filed their claim and multiple other claims and are collecting off of or attempting to collect off of all of those claims at their home location. It will continue to take some time to go through this analysis, Blair. And so we continue to onboard additional staff to try to help in that area, and looking at additional means to continue onboarding additional investigators to go through that load and try to speed up some of that process.
Phil, Liz is asking when did we know about the larger number of 6.5 million? I think you spoke to that earlier.
So Liz, this will be interesting because we gave you that $19 million figure today. And the one thing we can tell you is that as we investigate the suspected fraud, we know that that $19 million figure is also going to increase going through them as we find more that may actually be criminal activity. We know some of you have focused on whether you had information related to banks returning funds to us. That does not guarantee that was fraudulent activity, and that was actually bolstered by guidance provided by the United States Department of Labor just this week. Those still require investigation on every one of those claims also to ensure that it's fraudulent and for those funds that were seized. So we knew all along when we gave you that $6.5 million figure that the figure was going to change and move. We knew it wasn't going to go down. It can only go up. And the matter is how quickly it goes up as to what type of job we did related to preventing this fraud. I will remind you at this point in time, there were other states that didn't even take preventative measures into fraud until they were $600 million or several billion dollars into the hole on fraud that had occurred. We were taking steps far ahead of that. We are realistic enough to understand that by the time we get through all of this, those figures will continue to grow, but we are confident that our figures will be far lower than any other state that has faced the level of fraud that we have faced.
Phil, I think you have answered Marshall's in a previous interview. If you want to take Marshall and Aldo, I'll take Rob and Liz. Oh,
sure, Marshall. This is going to depend also on their question, because when they dial that number, the 303-536-5615 number, that would generally be the conversion call center. However, there are some calls that get flagged and go directly to our call center to provide assistance. And so individuals who have technical difficulties, certainly this is why we drive them to contact us. We do provide through appointments the abilities for those individuals to visit us, to utilize some of the technology that we have at our site to allow them to go through the ID Me process, whether that is speaking with the trusted referee or being able to upload all the information and pass through the electronic process, which again, as we will reiterate, takes about 5 to 15 minutes. And I will reiterate at this point in time, because I know all of you are hearing from the people that have difficulty with this process. Why would anybody that was getting through in 5 to 15 minutes reach out to you? It doesn't make for good press. It doesn't make for a good story. So you are certainly hearing from that roughly 14 to 16% that are experiencing problems getting through ID Me. Multiple reasons, Marshall, why they would have difficulty getting through ID Me. Some of them, again, are they lack that technology required. Some of them have difficulty with technology and need assistance with it. And some of them, Marshall, are actually fraudsters. And some of them are fraudsters that are reaching out to you, to the legislature, and to other press entities on board here today. So we will tell you from individuals that you have all passed on to us to review, There have been contained within those individual lists that each of you have passed on to us through investigations, fraudsters who are trying to utilize you to get through us. So I'm going to remind you of one other thing here too, because we keep seeing the stories over and over and over again regarding the difficulty with ID Me. We understand the frustration. In our perfect world where we're trying to balance things, we wouldn't have to send everybody through ID Me. As we have found in this process, PII is just not accurate anymore to verify an individual's identity, and you need additional tools, including some of that minor biometric data that is being required of ID Me. You know, a copy of your ID and then a selfie. It's pretty minor biometric information they are asking for you at that point in time. Reason for that is to better confirm who you are. But I will remind you that there are parties that reach out to you engaged in fraudulent and criminal activity that are advanced on to us that we ultimately confirm as fraud.
Thanks, Phil. I'm gonna toss it over to Cher to answer the next couple of questions. Cher?
So people who are caught up in the fraud holds unintentionally, look, there is no perfect answer. This is an imperfect solution to a global pandemic that has caused not only historic levels of unemployment, but criminal activity preying on innocent victims. It's important to note anybody who is a victim of UI fraud has had their identity stolen. There's been no breach of CDLE systems. At some point in the past, their identity was compromised. And these thieves now are preying on an opportunity, as we saw during the Great Recession when fraud reached additional levels, certainly not to the degree we're seeing now. And so we have to strike a balance between how do we detect and prevent fraudulent payments, knowing that there is no perfect system or solution and that innocent claimants could very well be caught up in that system. We've been advising claimants on what they need to be prepared to present to ID Me through the verification process. 85% of those folks don't ever need to speak to a person, and hundreds of thousands are getting their identities verified successfully. But it is new technology. It can be confusing technology, or there can be some circumstances, poorly lit photos, expired identification. We know DMV offices have been closed. An expired piece of identification is not unusual right now, and those circumstances do require somebody to speak to an agent. So from an ID verification perspective, there is no perfect solution, and we hope that, as we reported yesterday, we are seeing a downward trend in continued claims. We hope that continues. Some of that could be because now we have been applying ID Me and ID verification processes where previously criminals were able to just continue requesting benefits with no checks and balances. We do think that will continue to impact a downward trend with claims. Those that are caught up in these fraud holds, it's really, we know they are in desperate need of these benefits. And every day, as Phil said, we're working with this vendor to run network analytics to free up those claims that unfortunately are caught in this situation. And we'll continue to improve our systems as ID Me also staffs up and adds resources so that folks get access to services on a more timely basis. I'm not, Liz's question, how has it helped? Explain why it doesn't help when it comes to stolen information. Phil, go ahead.
That's interesting, Liz. It actually helps. That's why we're utilizing ID Me. The stolen information is PII out there on the dark web. There are currently, we have received information on the dark web. There currently is available and guaranteed for sale clean PII that has not yet been used to file an unemployment insurance claim and is guaranteed to allow somebody to try to collect unemployment insurance benefits. That's where PII, and some of you may have had another vendor reach out this week and trying to sell you a story that's really been a sales pitch during the week about how they can assist in this realm. And yet when that focuses on some of the PII and maybe some online network analytics, it's focusing on some of those very things that are being purchased online and utilized to file these unemployment insurance claims. Remember, ID Me is then forcing individuals to go through a process through some biometrics to verify their identity. ID Me continues to adjust and upgrade their processes. They are also the top of the line. If we were talking vehicles related to identity verification processes, they're either a Lamborghini or a Ferrari compared to a Ford Pinto. And at this point in time, utilizing straight PII is a Ford Pinto. at this point to try to verify somebody's identity. It's unfortunate. It's sad that that's the world we live in, but that is the world that we live in at this point in time.
And Wayne, I dropped in our response to, as Phil said, there's a competitor who has been pitching a story that they have a superior product to ID.me. And that is not our space that we choose to step into. We can only say there was not a sole source. I've dropped in the language in response to that. They were procured via a price agreement. Are we happy with the level of service? I think ID.me themselves have acknowledged that there's work to do with their customer service levels. I think it's also an indication of how these criminals have been able to attack every state system. And we're seeing them move from one system to the next. Once a state implements fraud identifiers and once a state implements IDD technology, then they are also moving to other states who have less sophisticated protocols in place. So we're hopeful that they will maintain their commitment to staffing up and helping to shore up their resources to help folks who do need some agent intervention.
And
Phil, didn't you say last week on the webinar that you weren't happy with the level of customer service?
Well, again, ID.me is not happy with their level of customer service also, right? We need to understand a couple of things here. And I'm going to go back to when the pandemic began. I know it seems like a long, long, long time ago, but it was only a year ago that it began. And so if you remember the sheer volume that all states were seeing on incoming claims, remember the difficulty. What were the stories that were being run at that time? How nobody could get in, nobody could file their claims, whether it was this state or any other state. So that was a volume issue. That's the same thing that ID.me is dealing with right now, because their product is so good at detecting these fraudulent claims or fraudulent identities. More and more states continue to come on board with them as a preferred vendor for utilization. And as such, they also have a lot of backlog that they are trying to run through the system at the same time. We have also done that to ID.me from the standpoint that we had brand new PUA claims being filed go through ID.me. Then we moved on to brand new state unemployment insurance claims going through ID.me. And then we were also running through those that had fraud holds who had contacted us going through ID.me. And given those levels of fraud that we continue to see on a weekly basis, or those attempts continuing to grow, even when we put ID.me first in place. So Wayne, to give you an idea, the first week we put ID.me in place, we saw an immediate drop in claim filings, initial claim filings. The week after that, however, the fraudsters decided to try to come back through and start to file those claims again. So we saw an absolute increase in the number of fraud holds that were going on claims and in numbers filed those following weeks. Seeing the number of claims filed and with some incoming fraud reports that we received from the public and from employers led us to believe we needed to do some other things and start running everybody through ID.me now. Unfortunately, we weren't the only state that saw that same uptick at that same point in time. So multiple other states are trying to run a lot of other individuals who they had believed were who they said they were through that process at this point in time. So that's created a huge volume for ID.me to try to deal with. I know people are frustrated at 5 hours. I know we've also heard people who it's not 5 hours, they're waiting multiple hours or a couple of days before they get contacted back. We work with ID.me again every week on this process. They continue to onboard additional staff. They are onboarding staff virtually weekly. They are onboarding a large number of staff located in the Tampa, Florida area, and they are continuing to try to meet these needs as they move forward. Obviously, with anything, it does take a little bit of while to get through that initial push on the volume. I would expect, Wayne, that over time this is going to stabilize as they can continue to hire more people and get more parties through and done on that backlog. It's just unfortunate timing at this point in time also, as more and more states also look at the capabilities of their system and what they have done. If you've seen, Blake has certainly been more than happy to do interviews and provide parties with some of the information they've stopped, some of the information they provided, some of the information related to phony IDs or what people are trying to do to get around those IDs. So again, a lot of it's a volume problem. It will continue to stabilize as we move forward. So they know we're not happy, but let's be honest, they're not happy about it, and they're taking steps to address it at this point in time. And again, We can find no other product out there right now anyway that we believe is effective as, again, this is, I'll call it again, the Lamborghini of ID verification at this point in time. And I think, Wayne, I'm going to follow up on Andy Kinney's question here. For folks without access to the right tech, can they resolve their problems through the call center alone? Or was I saying they actually need to go into a physical location? We ask them to call the call center so we can figure out what they need to do and to get through the process, Andy. Sometimes they need to make an appointment to come visit us. Sometimes it's a suggestion of a couple of things they may need to do with the current technology that they have at this point in time. Again, Andy, I think you and I have discussed this previously too. One of the things it establishes is sometimes there's a digital divide within any state. It's not just a rural versus urban type thing. There's a digital divide even among individuals based on age group and where they reside. So this will continue to be an area that we will continue to work on. ID.me is continuing to try to work in this area by securing some other locations where individuals can go in there physically and complete those tasks.
So I
Let's
think
take
we're,
one more. Go ahead, Chair. Sorry.
let's go ahead and send it to Ryan. I think we're answering the same questions repeatedly. So let's make sure we get time to answer or get to Ryan's presentation, and then we'll circle back.
All right, thanks, Sharon. So abrupt shift here. We're going to talk about the March employment situation numbers. The data I will discuss today are based in part on estimates from 2 surveys. Statistics like the unemployment rate, labor force, total employment, and the number of unemployed are derived from a survey of households, otherwise known as the current population survey. Simply put, the household survey is meant to capture the employment and labor force status of individuals within Colorado during a given period. This household survey also includes the self-employed, independent contractors, farm workers, and those not attached to a traditional payroll employer. However, we are unable to break out those individuals at the state level. Non-farm payroll estimates come from a survey of business establishments and government agencies and are intended to measure the number of jobs, not the number of people employed. These estimates exclude employees in agriculture, private households, and the self-employed. As we noted in today's press release, the reference period for the establishment and household surveys was the pay period a week that includes the 12th of the month. So specifically for March, that's March 7th to March 12th, I believe, 14th. Therefore, these data provide a snapshot of Colorado's employment situation as the state was experiencing relatively low levels of COVID-19 cases compared to the November to January period. Revisions to March data, along with preliminary estimates for April, will be released Friday, May 21st. For the household survey, Colorado's seasonally adjusted unemployment rate was unchanged in March when compared to February's revised rate of 6.4%. The primary driver in the 0.2 of a percentage point change to February's rate was a slight downward revision of the month's labor force estimate, a downward revision of about 4,400. Additionally, the number of unemployed individuals last month were 700 higher than in February, but due to rounding, the unemployment rate remained unchanged. The state's unemployment rate has dropped 0.5 of a percentage point since December. In March, Colorado had the 34th lowest unemployment rate in the nation. 4 states had the lowest rates at 2.9%, and Hawaii had the highest rate at 9%. The unemployment rate fell to 6% in March. In addition to the unemployment rate, Colorado's labor force participation rate held steady at 68.5% and ranked as the 3rd highest in the nation last month. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, Colorado had the 6th fastest recovery in labor force participation rate in February compared to the rate in February 2020. For March, Colorado's rank in recovery of the labor force participation rate ranked 8th. Additionally, over the past year, Colorado's labor force has grown by 89,000, which translates to a growth rate of 2.9%. And that is actually the fastest rate of growth in labor force in the US over that period. Only one other state, North Carolina, has added more individuals to their labor force over the past year than Colorado. And Colorado is also one of just 15 states to experience positive gains in labor force over the past year. As we mentioned in today's press release, there are the 5 counties with the highest not seasonally adjusted unemployment rates were Huerfano, Los Animas, Pueblo, Fremont, and Rio Grande. Among the 7 metropolitan areas in the state, Pueblo had the highest unemployment rate at 8.7%. Boulder and Fort Collins had the lowest rates at 5.5 and 5.8% respectively. And then Denver, Colorado Springs, Greeley, and Grand Junction all had rates between 6.7 and 7.2%. And it is recommended to compare all these sub-state rates I mentioned to the statewide not seasonally adjusted unemployment rate, and that was 6.5% in March. For the establishment survey, the preliminary estimates show that on a seasonally adjusted basis, Colorado added 6,600 non-farm payroll jobs from February to March. Additionally, February payroll figures were revised up by 3,900 jobs. And so that altered the change from January to a gain of 9,100 rather than the originally reported 5,200. And as a reminder, monthly revisions are based on additional responses from business and government agencies since the last published estimates. The state has added 46,100 payroll jobs in the first 3 months of 2021. That ranks as the 11th most jobs gained so far in 2021. However, do keep in mind that some of that growth in the payroll figures is in response to jobs lost in late 2020. Colorado has now regained 229,600 of the 375,800 non-farm payroll jobs lost in March and April of last year. The total job gains of 229,600 over the past 11 months represent a recovery of around 61% of those jobs lost earlier in the year, which ranks as the 30th fastest rate of recovery in the nation over that period. A similar analysis of the change in the U.S. non-farm payroll jobs since April revealed the U.S. has added back a little over 62% of lost jobs. In a reversal from the prior 2 months, leisure and hospitality lost jobs in March. That industry supersector shed 1,100 payroll jobs on a seasonally adjusted basis last month. At a more detailed industry level, the arts, entertainment, and recreation sector accounted for 800 of those 1,100 job losses. And as a reminder, ski resorts are concentrated within that particular sector within leisure and hospitality. On the other side, however, 4 industry supersectors had sizable gains in March. Professional and business services added 3,300 jobs. Trade, transportation, utilities gained 1,300. Private education, health services, 1,100, and other services a gain of 1,000. It's notable that within the professional and business services, the professional and technical services sector added 2,100 jobs. So accounted for 2,100 of the 3,300 gains within professional and business services. Government grew by 800 in March. That industry has added 2,900 payroll jobs so far in 2021, which trails only 2 other Colorado sectors for most jobs added in this year. As a reminder, government shed 28,300 jobs between February and December of last year, and most of that was driven by losses within local and state education within government. The private sector added 5,800 jobs in March, with February payroll numbers revised up an additional 4,000 jobs. From May to March, private businesses have added 241,400 payroll jobs, compared to losses of 362,200 in March and April. And that represents a recovery of about 67% of private sector jobs lost earlier in the year, and is very similar to the US recovery rate. Colorado's private sector job recovery rate ranks as the 27th fastest in the nation. And then finally, I just want to touch real quick on recovery rate for Substate Colorado, specifically the 7 metropolitan statistical areas, also known as MSAs, and the remaining residual of the state that is not in an MSA. Colorado Springs and Fort Collins had the fastest recovery rates through March of the 7 MSAs. Grand Junction and Denver had recovery rates similar to that of the state. And then the recovery rates for Pueblo, Boulder, and Greeley lag the rest of the state. And now I've mentioned before that we do not break out non-farm payroll jobs by county. We can look at a recovery rate for the residual of the state that is not in an MSA, and that's basically an aggregate of the remaining 47 non-metro counties. Those areas shed a combined total of 59,300 payroll jobs in early 2020, but have regained back 36,700, or 62% of those lost jobs. A dip in tourism-related employment is probably one driver to explain why, on a seasonally adjusted basis, non-metro Colorado has shed 500 payroll jobs in the first 3 months of 2021. And with that, I'll move it back to Cher and Jessica and take a look at what questions we have.
Brian, we have a couple questions for you before we send it back over to the UI topics. The first one's from Aldo. Will the impacts of the big front range storm be contained in the April report? What explains our relative weakness given the strong US jobs report in March?
Aldo, you talk about this little tiny storm that's going on right now? It's like 2 to 4 inches now. I don't anticipate too much of an impact. Again, we had at the very tail end of our reference week in March that massive blizzard, but that was concentrated in a weekend. So it's possible, maybe tiny impacts, but again, these storms keep, actually we've had storms on reference week in February, March, and April now, but they're all on the very tail end of the reference week. And so I really don't expect too much impact. In terms of explaining weakness to Strong's US jobs report, what we're actually seeing is Colorado had a pretty strong January and February. And I think we're going to see some disconnect between when certain states have strong growth and certain states have relatively weaker growth. In the past 2 months, January and February, our primary driver was in leisure and hospitality. Then you could see that this month there was loss in leisure and hospitality. And again, I think that some of that disruption to what we would typically expect within like the ski and tourism season as that starts winding down in the March season. So I expect April to probably be stronger, but I think for the first half of 2021, Colorado might be out of sync with the US and some other states and vice versa. Wayne, what area was responsible for the 2,100 jobs added in professional and business? So Wayne, are you looking for professional and business services, professional and technical? I can get back to you on that. I don't know.
No, the 2,100 you mentioned during your narrative. I didn't get that.
So that's for the state number?
Yes.
Yes. So that was the state number, but I don't have let me get back to you, because here's the thing is that's a seasonally adjusted number, and we don't have professional technical services broken out seasonally adjusted by area. So it's just total non-farm that's seasonally adjusted by areas. So I can't really tell you if it was Denver or Colorado Springs.
Oh, no. I'm just saying the 2,100 to the 3,300. What was that? I missed it.
Oh, services, computer, system design. It's that sector of professional and business services.
You froze. Can you repeat it?
Professional and technical services.
Wayne. Oh, professional and technical. Thank you.
Yeah. As opposed to say like headquarters or, administrative support. Ed, explain a little more in depth why you think the unemployment rate is not going down. The rise in labor force participation still offsetting. Yeah, Ed, it's just very similar. So let's think about this here real quick. And I'll try to avoid a thought experiment like I did last time, but our February unemployment rate was revised downward from 6.4 to 6.2%. And you'd say, wow, this is great. It's being revised downward. But again, that's being driven by downward revision in the labor force, where we're saying we don't think there's many people in the labor force as we did when we initially reported that. And so what we're saying is, a very basic way to put this, Colorado's kind of being penalized for having strong labor force growth, where again, we're absorbing people in the labor force. We have the ability to, once things really start opening up from an economic standpoint, pandemic standpoint, absorb those people into employment status, where we're seeing the US and a lot of other states, there are still people not in the labor force. And that actually helps basically deflate the unemployment rates. Because if let's say you put in a bunch of people into the labor force and they would be in unemployed status, that would cause an increase in the unemployment rate. So again, I think it's really positive news for the remainder of the year for Colorado that we have such high absorption within the labor force. And I think that will really put us in a great spot for the remainder of the year. And any other questions? I think that's it.
I think that's all for Ryan. We're gonna go back up to Phil now to answer some of the questions we didn't get to in regards to fraud. Phil's gonna answer George's question. Phil?
Sure. I'll try to work around and include as many of you as I can within each of these answers, because some of them actually play into some of your other questions at this point in time. So George, you're asking, can we discuss how the division plans to address overpayments made by reimbursable employers related to fraud? Understand at this point in time, as we confirm fraud, we make adjustments to employer accounts to reduce charging to their accounts. The same thing occurs for reimbursable employers, comes off of their bill. What will happen for those reimbursable employers who may have already paid in based on something they consider to be fraudulent? In case once we're able to confirm that's fraudulent, that would result in a credit on any kind of future bill for them. And so they would be owing less on a future bill at this point in time. They'd also be owing less at a point in time where the federal government has reduced the percentage that the reimbursable employers ultimately end up paying by moving the reimbursement or the credit that is given to reimbursable employers from 50% up to 75%. I also think this is important, George, as we talk about lost funds and that focus on reimbursable employers. But if we also look at our contributory employers at this point in time, what happens related to those overpayments? This is why over and over again, we have said we're not going to discuss certain ongoing investigations. We're not going to discuss suspected fraud numbers. We're not going to discuss information that may have been obtained related to particular banks or accounts at this point in time. I'll draw you all back to the fact that we have engaged with the Attorney General's office in a task force at this point in time. And to the extent that they would be working on any kind of criminal prosecutions or anything at this time, to make any statements would potentially jeopardize those investigations also. So anytime we release information that could jeopardize any one of those investigations, we are also jeopardizing the opportunity to seize funds and to recover funds that for contributory employers go back into the trust fund. For PUA goes back and reduces the overall impact on federal tax employers at this point in time. I think I will roll into Rob Lowe's question just to clarify. Can we clarify the difference between the 19 million in fraud paid out and the 433 million in fraud? Essentially what we're telling you there, Rob, is that we have prevented 22.5, actually 22.7 times more fraud than has actually paid out. So yes, there has been fraud that's paid out, but we have confirmed at this point in time preventing 22.7 times more than has been paid out. So and then to follow up, Rob, so the 37 billion, the amount of fraud you believe fraudsters in Colorado would have attempted to steal. Rob, if we hadn't have done anything, if we had not have put in fraud holds as we did early on, if we did not have people going through ID Me Now, as difficult as it is for some individuals, it did absolutely nothing. We would have paid out $37 billion in fraudulent payments, be looking around right now and answering questions from all of you as to why did we pay out $37 billion in fraudulent payments. And then I'll move on to Brian here. Can I explain how I believe scammers, fraudsters are using the media to further their schemes? Sure, Brian. This is simple. Fraudsters, what they really like to have is pressure come upon the system in multiple different ways. One, sheer volume. This is also why they've moved into state systems, not just in this state, but in multiple states that are dealing with this exact same issue. Employers out there get frustrated when all of a sudden they have a very small HR department and they have 300 claims come across their desk, none of which are for people who may have worked for them. Fraudsters are hoping employers just give up and don't report those to the various state agencies to shut down claims, or that they take extended periods of time to report those. The longer it takes to report them, the more there's an opportunity that weeks have paid out on those unemployment insurance claims. Fraudsters do the same thing related to Facebook. They will infiltrate Facebook groups And they will sit there and they will make comments about maybe not having gotten paid for a while, trying to rile up a whole nother group within Facebook. They will provide misinformation on Facebook, all again to try to drive pressure related to state agencies trying to prevent fraud in this venue. They do the same thing with the legislature. They reach out as if they are a constituent of that legislator and continue to bug them to bring pressure to bear for us to look at these claims. Constant stories where people reach out to you. Again, the vast majority of people reaching out to all of you are actual claimants who are experiencing serious problems going through the process. There are a fair number of those individuals, however, contacting you also who, again, as we've gone through and investigated, who are engaged in fraudulent activity. The hope is that by driving everything both through the press, through the legislature, through Facebook, such pressure comes to bear that politically we are asked or forced to step back from things that we are doing. In fact, I believe there was a story on a news outlet this week that didn't appropriately fact check some items that made it sound like and was put out there so that it could look like they forced some kind of change in something we were doing. Nothing could be further from the truth. We were following our normal plan on how we were rolling items out. But when you look at those kind of stories and you look at the pressure they are trying to bring to bear, if we bow down to that, if we say, yep, we're going to go backwards, just like that story that did no fact checking claim this week, then the fraudsters win. Because that means we say, nope, we're not going to verify everybody. We're just going to start letting money go back out. And that $37 billion we just referenced, that's how you get to that $37 billion figure on fraud paid out. We are all involved in this together, whether it is the media, whether it is claimants receiving items that they know they shouldn't have, whether it are our employer community out there. This is why we put tools out there for individuals to go online and report that there's items coming to their house that shouldn't be coming to their house, for employers to go there and report this is a fraudulent unemployment insurance claim. It's also why you will have individuals reaching out to you, or we have to ultimately make decisions to implement ID Me, which again, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to have everybody go through it. But again, it's an imperfect world right now. And so we have parties going through it. So these fraudsters, I will reiterate, are persistent. They are very smart. There is a reason why almost weekly you see that we've given you an increased number of fraud holds. That is because they spend a great deal of time trying to figure out exactly what our fraud holds are so that they can implement brand new means by which to receive several weeks of payments, a week of payment, 2 weeks of payments on multiple claims before we can discover what is going on and shut those down. Mind you, as we discover things, we pass those on to other states, just as other states pass that information on to us, as we are all trying to operate in a space where, quite frankly, our federal partner for all of these states has been very slow to the table on providing guidance and overall assistance. The amount of money some of you have asked that they have provided for fraud prevention is ultimately a drop in the bucket when you consider that we have received less than $5 million for the last 2 years to try to implement fraud measures to stop this phenomenal attempted amount of fraud that's going on, that again uses every avenue possible to try to bring pressure upon us so we don't implement some of these tools, or so that we step back from implementing those tools and continue to pay out those benefits.
Phil, can I, we have a few more questions and we're almost out of time. I just wanted to give a kind of a broader perspective on fraud nationally. We were on a national call yesterday. One state reported that over the Easter weekend, they had received upwards of 100,000 new claims that had gone through their system, which they suspect the majority of which are fraud. Several other states have actually had to take down their entire UI system for days, impacting both legitimate claimants to implement more strict fraud detection and prevention measures. So we think in Colorado, we started our efforts early last summer, and that has resulted in our estimates of how much we've been able to prevent. I did just want to touch on Marshall's question. I would say, and I probably lean on Jessica and others, almost every media outlet on the call has inadvertently sent us an individual posing as a legitimate claimant who turned out to be under investigation of some type. Now, whether those leads to us turned into a source on the record, I don't think so, but I think to Phil's point, the reality is a number of them certainly do tell what seem to be some compelling stories, and then upon further review by our investigations unit are under investigation for a number of issues. And without, again, getting into what those issues are, we ask that you would just be mindful that there are some very difficult situations legitimate claimants are facing. There are also, unfortunately, some criminal activity who, without any kind of moral compass or thought process about what they're doing to innocent victims, continue to prey on the system.
And I think I would follow up again a little more on Marshall's. Do we have specific name post interviews conducted by journalists that have been used to perpetuate a fraudulent claim? Again, Marshall, we have that. We know who these individuals are. We wouldn't disclose it because that would be an ongoing criminal investigation, which hampers the ability to try to bring those individuals to justice at this point in time and recoup any funds.
Do you want to bring it back up to Elizabeth Schubert's question, Phil, is about eligibility in the public health order? Can you take that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Elizabeth, right? Because that would be concerning for individuals as that public health order expires. If you're continuing on your PUA claim or your regular state claim, it may not impact you at all. There could be an impact if there was a job offered to you at this point in time and you refused it. However, the legislature, not this current session, but last session, made some changes to the statute, providing for some opportunity for individuals to refuse particular jobs. Again, part of that does require whether there's an ongoing emergency declared by the governor or whether there's also a health order. There are other items that already existed within the statutory scheme that individuals being required to work or return to work in a location that might be detrimental to their health or safety certainly would not be denied benefits. Again, related to any job refusal or any separation from employer, the responsibility falls upon the claimant to ultimately establish that that's the environment that exists in order to continue receiving unemployment insurance benefits. But it is a good question, Elizabeth. Thank you.
So I think we need to.
My question about the calling into the call center if you have trouble with ID.me, did I hear that correctly?
What we said, Wayne, is if there's a technology issue that an individual can call in and schedule an in-person appointment.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Aldo and Phil, I'll let you weigh in. Aldo, the difference is that, as you know, we reported that $6.5 million confirmed late last year. And as Phil said, we always knew that that number would grow considerably. When you look at confirmed fraud and what we're reviewing as suspected fraud, you're always going to see confirmed fraud grow as that suspected number moves one way or the other into a released legitimate claim or a confirmed fraudulent claim. We believe that most of the fraudulent activity continues to happen in the PUA program outside of the state system. But as we reported late last year, the criminals did begin targeting the state system once the CARES Act expired at the end of the year. Right now, the activity continues to be targeted in the federal pandemic unemployment assistance programs. Phil, anything to add?
No, I think you addressed that well. Andy Kinney, before we go, could someone speak quickly to the state auditor's findings and how CBLE will respond? A little tricky here, Andy. I would remind everybody that sometimes being an auditor is great because you're getting to go back to look at things after they happen, including things that have been unprecedented, that haven't occurred ever before. And then you're picking apart how parties might have addressed or moved money around related to those issues. So again, always easy to go back after the fact. and look at things and tell parties where they did them wrong or you didn't appropriately make some adjustments here. But it does provide some lessons learned so that we can continue to move forward in the future and implement some steps to try to avoid those, not just during a normal year, Andy, but again, so that the division and our financial unit are well prepared for any other pandemic or rapid change that would occur that would impact the unemployment insurance program. Likewise, Andy, it's actually gaps that were discovered that other divisions across the state could utilize and maybe improve upon all of their processes. Again, though, I will remind you the absolute growth of unemployment insurance claims that we saw immediately and the requirement to try to get parties paid rapidly. I'm not sure anybody in their right mind could have estimated how much might end up as potential overpayments, how much of that might be booked for a current state fiscal year that really wouldn't pay until the following fiscal year, given the absolute increase that we saw there. And I think early days we saw sometimes up to $2,000% increase, 1,500% increase. Overall for the whole year, well over 400% increase. That sheer volume made it very difficult to make those estimations. But again, something that you learn from when you have those findings. So we will learn from it. We will improve in that realm.
What about Rob's question on the current figure for fraud holds?
We don't have that. It varies every day. I think as Phil indicated, one day it might be caught in an integrity hold, the next day it's released. And so we work through those. It's really a fluid number, Rob and Wayne. Okay, before we close and maybe we follow up with Marshall in email, I did just want to make sure we clarified something we mentioned in our employer fraud webinar a couple of weeks ago. We are sending letters to individuals and employers who have reported into us. They have either been a victim of fraud or the company believes there's fraudulent activity. Just wanted to clarify, those letters are only because somebody has reported in. We are not sending letters out to anybody who has not actively reported into us. These letters, again, are designed to serve to be shared with credit reporting agencies and the credit bureaus. So just to clarify, those are in response to somebody reporting in their identity's been stolen to file UI fraud or an employer has had fraud committed. That to say, we do continue to send letters when a claim is filed to the individual for whom the claim was filed, and that has become one of our best indicators to a victim that their identity was stolen and used to commit UI fraud. Well, we might as well just finish with Marshall's question. So first of all, Marshall, we contracted with this firm and they expanded their talent pool to include Colorado. So they're not just hiring individuals in Florida. They are actually hiring individuals, as all call centers are doing now that they've had to move to a virtual environment. They are hiring individuals, not just in Florida. The call center staff are all trained by our staff. So they daily receive training updates, information from our management side, in addition to the call center management side. So simply because they are not physically located in Colorado doesn't mean they don't know how to advise Coloradans on what to do to get support and assistance. Phil, anything to add?
No, and I would say, Marshall, this is a question we've heard again over and over again, contending it's an out-of-state service. Of course, it's an out-of-state service, but it's employing people throughout the United States. And so I will remind you at this point in time, those are individuals who are employed, earning money, not collecting unemployment, but doing a job and trying to assist others, regardless of what state they are in at this point in time. They certainly have increased the number of Colorado personnel that they have working for them at this point. But I think the thing to recall is that the pandemic did not just impact jobs and the economy in the state of Colorado. It impacted jobs and the economy throughout the entire United States. So to the extent that these individuals are employed providing services, that overall is good for the US economy and not just maybe the Colorado economy. And I think we need to look at things as a whole and not just the Colorado economy, but how is the US economy doing and how is that doing related to job creation and individuals back at work and or providing services.
Okay, everyone, it looks like we're over time, so we are going to wrap things up.